already? Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Erica Suheda. I am the Executive Director of the Neenah Historical Society, and we're so thrilled to kick off our fall library programming with a very fun topic. I would like to thank the Neenah Public Library and Maida for hosting us. Mike Thomas retired earlier this year, so Maida is the new face of library programming for the library here, and we're so grateful. I'd like to remind everyone, if you have not already visited the Octagon House, that is the home to the Neenah Historical Society. We have an exhibit open right now that is all about the childhood experience of growing up in Neenah. So a very fun walk down memory lane. I encourage you all to come visit. And a shameless plug for membership to the Neenah Historical Society. It is with our membership that we're able to put on these programs and to do all of the amazing community outreach that we do every year. With that, I know some of you might have been expecting Neenah Neighborhoods tonight. There was a slight snafu in the Neenah News. They inverted the calendar but wrote an article on Prohibition. So they were slightly confused, but tonight's presentation is indeed on Prohibition and the Temperance Movement in Neenah. So just want to set the tone a little bit. We have a programming and education committee at the Historical Society, and we get together a couple times every year and talk about presentation ideas. What would we like to learn more about? What do we think people would be interested in? And we all thought Prohibition and Temperance would be very interesting because if you've been here for any period of time, you may have heard that Neenah is dry and Menasha was wet. I will assure you we were both very wet. And you will learn more about that this evening. So we did quite a bit of local research, not just in our own archives, but also reached out to Joellen at First Presbyterian Church. They had quite lengthy archives on temperance and prohibition, and Miranda also took a trip to the ARC at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh and looked up court records. So anyone that we could find that maybe got in a little bit of trouble, we tried to find their court records to drill in a little bit further, and you'll learn more about that as well. So obviously it's a big topic and there's a lot to cover and not a ton of time. So what we're going to do for you this evening is talk about temperance and prohibition on a national scale, what was happening in the country, and then what was happening here at a local level. How is it similar? How is it different? And things like that. So I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful presenter, Kara Rothkegel. She's a local historian, travel guide extraordinaire. She just got off a plane earlier today, so we're hoping.
Thank God it was on time.
But yeah, I'm just thankful she landed on time. So with that, here's Carol.
Okay, I have the tiny mic. Can you hear me okay? Is it? Oh, totally. Okay. Then I know that's a whole thing. All right. Wonderful. So I'm Kara Rothkegel. I'm a volunteer with the Neenah Historical Society. I really appreciate that they call me a local historian. I just have my BA in history, so it makes me feel pretty official to be called a historian. So I'm going to be talking about Prohibition and the Temperance Movement in Neenah. So what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about Prohibition? It's usually flappers, Al Capone, speakeasies, smoky rooms, deals gone wrong. But Prohibition is it is the first time that the government decided to legislate morality by banning alcohol. So Prohibition wasn't just a story of big cities and famous names, it was a movement that touched every community in America, including here in Neenah. So the temperance movement and the 18th Amendment grew out of decades of debate over alcohol's place in society. Nationally, it was fueled by concerns over family life, health, religion, and morality. But just as importantly, it played out in local taverns, city halls, churches, and even in family kitchens. So in this presentation, we're going to take a look at the national story of Prohibition and the temperance movement, and then we're going to bring it closer to home, exploring how these same forces shaped daily life in Neenah, and how our community reflected larger trends and in some case, how it forged its own unique path through this turbulent era in American history. But let's start with the temperance movement. Can someone tell me, what is the difference between temperance and prohibition? Go ahead at the back.
Temperance just is that you should moderate your use of alcohol as opposed to prohibition.
Yes, so temperance, it wasn't always about just banning alcohol completely. It was moderating your alcohol intake, but also your sugar intake and other really rich things as well. It wasn't just about alcohol. Prohibition is the law for it, and prohibiting it completely. So the temperance movement, it grew out of the same reform spirit that fueled abolition, women's rights, and education reform in the early 19th century. So many reformers saw alcohol as one of the biggest threats to moral and social progress. But drinking was a daily part of American life in the early 1800s. People drank at meals, at work, in taverns, and even at political gatherings. Per capita, alcohol consumption was nearly 3 times higher than today. But let's put this into perspective too. People aren't going around drinking 10% alcohol beers, or they're not drinking liquor all day. At this time, water is not as clean as it is today. So what are you going to drink instead of water? Well, beer was seen to be quite healthy because water is filtered, it's heated up. So people are drinking that for health reasons, not just to get drunk. So people did drink at work. Obviously, they didn't have OSHA back then, so that was fine. But the American Temperance Society was founded in 1826, and it was hugely influential. And by the 1830s, it had over 1 million members. Their early focus was on moderation, and it encouraged people to limit or avoid hard spirits. So beer and wine, that's okay. It's liquor that they saw as the problem. Then they had the Washingtonian movement in the 1840s, and that added a personal moral element. And that was, it emphasized individuals to publicly proclaim their sobriety. So take a pledge, say you're gonna be sober, you're not gonna drink. Kind of like Alcoholics Anonymous does today, but maybe not everyone was an alcoholic at that time. So these groups set the stage for the idea that alcohol was not just a personal choice, but a societal issue that required reform. Now during the Civil War, obviously temperance kind of took a back seat. This was a pretty tumultuous time in American history, and it shifted priorities away from social reform. So national survival became more important, and soldiers were often given alcohol rations to boost morale, and probably more importantly, for medicinal purposes, to dull pain. They didn't have painkillers back then, so if you ran out of chloroform, you used alcohol. And this made it hard to argue for abstinence during wartime. Interestingly enough, the federal government also began taxing alcohol to fund the Union war effort. So this is where the alcohol tax originated from. And this made liquor revenue essential and created a direct conflict. Alcohol was both seen as dangerous, but it was financially necessary. So as a result, the movement lost a lot of momentum during the 1860s. But reformers didn't give up. They regrouped after the war. But what happened after the Civil War? We had a huge wave of immigration to the US. So particularly from Germany and Ireland, where drinking, especially Germans, Irish, it's part of your culture. Germans had brought the beer culture with them, and they established breweries across the Midwest, especially in Wisconsin. Companies like Pabst and Schlitz and Miller became household names. And in 1872, here's a fun fact, 550 million gallons of beers were drunk that year. So beer was the drink of choice. And it was marketed as wholesome and family friendly, and a great alternative to whiskey or rum. And that is what had dominated earlier American drinking culture. So breweries became powerful economic and political forces during this time. In the cities, they supported local politicians, sponsored cultural festivals, and it was a symbol of immigrant pride in many of these communities. But this directly clashed with temperance reformers, who were largely middle class, Protestant, and native born. So a lot of those who were native born, so maybe more than 2 generations have been here in the US, were going up against immigration at the time. So this is kind of, they were butting heads on this. They saw saloons as centers of crime, corruption, and disorder. So the rise of brewing made the push for prohibition even more contentious, because it wasn't just about alcohol now. It was also about culture, immigration, and identity. So let's talk about some of the key beliefs during this time. At the core, of course, it was alcohol. And that alcohol was the root of all of our problems. So poverty, crime, and broken families. They blamed it all on alcohol. Domestic violence was often linked towards alcohol at this time, and women and children were the ones who bore the brunt of it. Workplace accidents. So remember, people were apparently drinking on the job back then. There were a lot of accidents that happened. So people in the temperance movement said, this is a problem, especially as the US industrialized in this time. And drunkenness on the job could be deadly, of course. And also made people less effective at their jobs. So they weren't getting as much done. Religion played a huge role because many Protestant denominations taught that sobriety was not just a good habit, but it was your spiritual and moral duty. So it tied to, at this time, it's the Victorian times, this broader ideal of morality and self-control. So reformers argued that banning alcohol would lead to stronger families and a more productive workers, and so a more moral nation. But for women, temperance was also tied to empowerment at this time. So let's talk about the big bad wolf. Let's talk about these saloons and taverns, these dens of iniquity. So saloons were more than drinking establishments at this time. They were the social, political, and economic centers for many communities. For working class men, especially immigrants, the saloon was a place to relax after working long hours. You could find camaraderie, and you could make connections. So workers would often cash their paychecks at saloons as well. Politicians used saloons to build support, to hand out favors, and organize votes. So they're very critical hubs of urban, especially in urban and cities. It was critical for the political machine. Voting even took place at many saloons. Labor unions and immigrant associations met in saloons. But as I said, reformers saw them as dens of vice. This is where people go for gambling and prostitution and crime. So for temperance advocates, the saloon symbolized everything that was destructive about alcohol culture. And the conflict over saloons, it wasn't just about drinking. Then it becomes a problem with class, culture, and the control of public life. Yes, Erica? I told you should just keep the mic.
Okay, I just want to mention that this particular building is still standing in Neenah. This is in Sherrytown. It is adjacent to the railroad tracks. So this is a hotel, a restaurant, and a sample room, right? So you could go here as a place to stay, a place to drink, a place to get a hot meal, and it is still serving up Neenah customers today.
Yes, it's at 432 Sherry Street. And Frank Spielbauer was the proprietor here. So the temperance movement in Neenah, it was happening here. So local chapters had early temperance societies. Protestant churches in the Fox Valley were strong voices in temperance. And that echoed the national religious movement that was going on as well. And small town reform culture in Neenah paralleled the national wave. So church leaders and civic groups were the ones that were really promoting moderation in alcohol use. So here's an example. In 1882, temperance speaker James Dunn visited Neenah and Menasha. So his job was to promote abstinent societies, give public lectures on the dangers of alcohol. And he would actually encourage locals to come up and share their stories or sign a pledge of abstinence. So speakers like Dunn were crucial because they brought the message of temperance to the smaller communities. It wasn't just in the big cities that these were happening, it was also in smaller communities too. So I like this one because it says, I don't know if you can read it, it says, Dunn has rattled it up lively for the old soakers in Menasha. But Neenah is a temperance city, so he will not make so many converts here. So basically saying, we're already into temperance here in Neenah, so he won't need to convert many people. But in Menasha, where the soakers are, apparently, it's a different story. Actually, and that's I had that preconceived notion as well. Menasha had quite a big temperance movement as well. So it wasn't just in Neenah where this was happening. But Menasha definitely had more of the immigrant side of things. A lot of Polish people moved there, so the culture identity with drinking kind of was more prevalent there, I would say. So reformers, they recognized that saloons weren't just about drinking, and they were community hubs. So what did they do to compete with that? How can you compete with that? Well, they created temperance restaurants and coffee houses where people could gather without alcohol. So these establishments often served simple meals along with drinks like coffee, tea, lemonade, and milk-based options. So in Wisconsin, where obviously dairy is abundant, buttermilk and milkshakes were promoted as the wholesome alternatives to beer. I don't know about you, but I cannot imagine drinking buttermilk. I'm being like, I feel great after that. So milkshake, sure. Buttermilk, I'm not too sure. Lemonade also became especially symbolic of temperance because it was refreshing, it was inexpensive, and it was family friendly. So these spaces tried to replicate the social role of saloons, but with more of a focus on morality and self-control. So they tried to lure men away from the taverns and to provide a safe place, not just for men, but for women and children to come as well. So while they never matched the popularity of the saloons, temperance restaurants reflect how reformers imagined a new social order, one where the community life didn't revolve around alcohol. So we have on the far, I can't do directions right now, left. Okay, yours, far left. Andrew Kemeter, thank you. He leased a building on Main Street and Wisconsin Avenue on the corner for a temperance restaurant. Not sure how well that did. Many of them didn't last very long here in Neenah. No, they did not. And then the buttermilk, there's an interesting quote that physicians say buttermilk is healthy in summer and good at all times, but other physicians said beer is the healthiest drink. Because, and I don't know if this is true, but it says, as the glucose replenishes the wasting tissue of the body. So apparently that's what happens in beer. I don't know. Women were also getting involved in Neenah in the temperance movement as well. They were holding socials in their parlors. They were hosting teas, bringing other women together to promote temperance societies. Now, with women, we should talk about the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU. I just really liked that picture. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. The WCTU was the most influential women's group in the temperance movement, and it was founded in Cleveland in 1874. It quickly grew into a national and an international force, with local chapters that were often called unions in towns and cities across the country, including Wisconsin and here in Neenah. Their motto was for God and home and every land. So it reflects their focus on religion, family protection, and global reform. So members were typically Protestant, middle-class women who saw alcohol as a direct threat to family stability, morality, and children's well-being. Frances Willard was one of their leaders. She's very famous with the WCTU, and she expanded beyond temperance. So Frances Willard advocated for women's suffrage, because if women could vote, then we could get prohibition. And she argued that women needed the vote to protect their families. They also supported reforms in education, labor laws, prison conditions, and public health. In Wisconsin, the WCTU was active throughout the 19th and 20th century, holding conventions, rallies, and campaigns in cities and smaller towns alike. And what's really interesting when you think about the WCTU is at this time, so women didn't have the right to vote, but it provided women with a public platform at a time when there were few other avenues for them to have civic participation. So for many women, joining a temperance union was their first step into organized activism. So in Neenah, we did have a women's Christian temperance union. It was very active. In fact, in 1885, the women's they hosted the Wisconsin Women's Christian Temperance Union and held its state meeting here in Neenah. In 1889, they had about 58 women who belonged to the Neenah chapter, and the chapter was active in the community even after Prohibition ended in 1933. So this is to give you an idea on how some chapters and women of the WCTU and other organizations campaign for temperance. Some were a bit violent. Some women would show up at saloons with hatchets, and they would just start breaking apart the saloons. So this article brings that up, and it says, in Appleton, a number of women visited the saloons not with hatchets, but with prayer. So a group of women were going up College Avenue and stopping at saloons to pray and to encourage people to come out of the dens of iniquity and to pray and give up the drink. But eventually they got to one saloon on College Avenue, and at the back there was like a half wall. And they were just starting to do their prayer, and somehow a hose turned on and aimed perfectly over the side and got all of them wet. So they had to stop, and the owner said, "I didn't do it, it was an accident." I guess we'll never know. So, some interesting stories from the community. So the WCTU was very influential, but we also had the Anti-Saloon League. The Anti-Saloon League was founded in 1893 in Ohio, and it quickly rose to dominate the temperance movement. So unlike earlier groups, the ASL focused less on persuading individuals to stop drinking and more on changing laws. So they developed a reputation as one of the first modern political pressure groups in America. So think of them as the first lobbyist group. So they endorsed candidates, they organized voters, and they put immense pressure on politicians at the local, state, and national level. So the League would build very strong alliances with Protestant churches and gave them a ready-made network of supporters across the country. They were skilled at grassroots campaigns, letter writing, and rallies to show politicians that Prohibition had massive support. So they also pushed for local options laws, and this allowed towns and counties to vote themselves dry. So even if the state or nationally we're not going dry, our county, Winnebago, we're gonna go dry. So this kind of created a prohibition patchwork. So some counties across the country were able to be dry. So ultimately it's their relentless lobbying that was part of the factor in passing the 18th Amendment. So remember how we said there was an alcohol tax during the Civil War? So the government says, well guys, what if we outlaw alcohol? How are we gonna get our money? Like, without alcohol, we can't collect the tax. And the ASL thought about it, and they said, I know, we'll tax incomes. So you can thank the ASL for the income tax. So this was a way for the government to make up those losses if they outlawed alcohol. Now the First Presbyterian Church here in Neenah was very active in the temperance movement, as Erica said, and they even donated money to the Anti-Saloon League. So I don't know if you can see, it's pretty small writing, but here under miscellaneous benevolences, it's the Anti-Saloon League. So they got $49. I don't know how much that is in today's money. It's probably quite a bit, a couple hundred, I would say, maybe.
I am not an inflation calculator, however. In looking through a number of these annual reports from First Presbyterian Church, it was a cornerstone of their church giving. So what they collected from the congregation was then put together and sent to organizations that they wanted to support, the Anti-Saloon League being a pinnacle of their support.
Yes, so temperance was one of the fruits of the Spirit in the Presbyterian Church. It meant self-control and moderation for them. So many Protestants, not all Protestants, it's mainly the Anglo-Saxon Protestants that supported the temperance movement. So later when the Germans are coming and the Scandinavians, they're Lutheran, but they're culturally pretty big drinkers. And then of course you have the Germans that are Catholic and the Polish that come, and they're also big drinkers. So not every Protestant church was very involved in the temperance movement. Go ahead.
Okay, so the research that we did, the two main churches in Neenah that were the biggest proponents of temperance and prohibition were First Presbyterian and the Methodist Church. So those are the two that we found the most records in support of this movement.
Yes. So Reverend Chapin did lectures often around town. Did I say that? Chapin? Chapin. Okay. It's not Chapin, sorry. He would do lectures on temperance, so we see those in a couple of the newspapers. They would just say he's doing a talk at such and such a time at this church on the temperance movement. So what changed? How did we get from the wishy-washy to prohibition? Well, World War I happened. And it created the perfect environment for the temperance movement to finally achieve national prohibition. So there's food shortages during war, and the need to conserve grain for bread. Reformers argued it's wasteful to use it for beer or whiskey. So there was a Food and Fuel Control Act of 1917, and that restricted alcohol production under the guise of wartime necessity. Also at this time, who are the bad guys in World War I? The Germans. So anti-German sentiment was very high at this time, and many of the nation's biggest brewers, Pabst, Schlitz, Anheuser-Busch, Miller, they're German. And they targeted the beer industry, and it became a form of patriotism. If you're gonna drink beer, it was seen as treason. So reformers also linked alcohol to inefficiency and disorder in the military, and they argued that the soldiers, factory workers, and farmers, they need to be sober and disciplined to win the war. So wartime measures like temporary prohibition near military bases laid the groundwork for nationwide prohibition. And by the time the war ended, the push for prohibition had so much momentum that the 18th Amendment was ratified in 1919. I like this farewell to thee until we meet again swan song. So the 18th Amendment was ratified in January 1919, and it went into effect January 1920. So there's a year in between there. So the amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol, but it didn't explicitly ban drinking alcohol. So people could still consume alcohol, and because they had a year in between when this went into effect, many people stockpiled alcohol in their houses. And because the amendment didn't clearly define what counted as intoxicating liquor, Congress passed the Volstead Act in October of 1919. And that act set the standard at 0.5%. So 0.5% means it's intoxicating. Anything higher than that. So that meant beer and wine were also banned, not just hard liquor. And that was way stricter than a lot of Americans thought it would be. So it also created an enforcement system, and it gave federal agents authority to raid the illegal operations and prosecute violators. And while it marked a major victory for temperance reformers, it also set the stage for widespread resistance, speakeasies, and bootlegging in the 1920s. So not all alcohol was banned, though, under the Volstead Act. Doctors could prescribe whiskey and other liquors for medicinal purposes, often for ailments like anxiety or high blood pressure, or even influenza, interestingly enough. So a lot of people, again, who had a year in between then, and they would say, oh man, my anxiety's so bad, Walgreens, I need a prescription for whiskey. That's really gonna help. And so they'd get 3 pints of whiskey a month for their medicinal purposes. Churches and synagogues could use wine for religious ceremonies, but the loophole was sometimes abused, and certain clergy distributed far more sacramental wine than they were supposed to. Industrial alcohol used for products like paint or fuel was legal, And bootleggers often found ways to redistill it into something that was drinkable. I'm not sure if I would want to do that, but. So importantly, remember, the law did not ban the consumption of alcohol. So people stockpiled it, and let's say it's past January 1920. If you were drinking in your home, that's fine. But if you're going to be out on the street drinking, that's a problem. And if you're noticeably intoxicated, like today, that's a problem. So it wasn't that, you know, if you had just even a scent of liquor on you, if you were walking normal or something, it was fine. But, so they weren't like arresting everyone or making them do sobriety tests or anything. So how did people get around these restrictions? You could make near beer. So this was beer with a low alcohol content. So it's usually like fermented fruit juice, and then it was made mildly alcoholic by fermentation. So a lot of people in homes and on farms would make near beer. And as long as it's not above 0.5%, that's fine. So people would actually sell near beer. So no license was required to sell that. So, did we have bars in Neenah during this time? Boy, did we ever. We had at least 30 in 1914. And so what happened? What did these places do post-January 1920? Well, they would switch to non-alcoholic drinks like milkshakes, sodas, or near beer. And that's how they tried to stay alive during Prohibition. Some became ice cream parlors or just a lunchroom. And from what Erica was able to find, 6 drinking establishments reopened with the same name and or proprietor post-Prohibition. Taverns in general came back in a vengeance after Prohibition. Many were in the same location, but they had a new name or a new owner. But 6 had the same owner and or name. So do you want to tell us about this fun photo you found on Flickr?
Is this the Canal Street one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this was a pre-Prohibition sample room in downtown Neenah. You can see the spittoons on the ground, and this is the perfect example, as Kara said, before Prohibition went into effect, there were at least 30 of these establishments in Neenah. And we're talking a much smaller footprint than what Neenah is today. So imagine in just a few square miles, having 30 drinking establishments have to close very abruptly. I'm sure Kara's gonna get into it, but again, some of them did reopen post-Prohibition, but it did come back with a vengeance, like over 40 by the time 1934 rolls around. So it was big business.
So Prohibition, when it goes down in Wisconsin, we were one of the hardest hit states. And that's because of our deep German-American brewing tradition. So beer was not only a beverage, but it was also part of the state's cultural identity and our economy. So Milwaukee at this time was known as the beer capital of the world. It was home to a lot of the major breweries, and each had to adapt or risk collapse. So many turned to producing near beer, soft drinks, malt extract, or even dairy products like cheese to stay in business. Now, enforcement varied widely across Wisconsin. In larger cities like Milwaukee, Green Bay, and Oshkosh, the authorities were sometimes more reluctant to crack down hard, so speakeasies flourished in these urban centers. In smaller towns and rural areas, enforcement was actually sometimes stricter here. It took them a while to get the process down of what it all means. So who do we arrest and for why? And so it took a little longer to get to Wisconsin and how it would be enforced. And then once it came, we obviously have this identity in beer and other alcohol. So Wisconsin became known as the wettest dry state during Prohibition. So for many Wisconsinites, Prohibition felt like an outsider-imposed law, and it clashed with our cultural identity. So that made compliance and enforcement very difficult here. So we have the Bureau of Prohibition, and that was established in 1920, and it was to enforce the Volstead Act. And Wisconsin was difficult for enforcement. So again, we have that long brewing tradition here. So alcohol was deeply woven into our social and cultural life. We had federal agents stationed in Milwaukee, Green Bay, and Madison, and they would raid the bootlegging operations, speakeasies, and breweries that were producing illegally. But enforcement was inconsistent at best. And partly, that's because there were too few agents, and partly because local police and officials sympathized with the communities, more than with the federal law. So corruption was a pretty big problem. Some agents and local law enforcement accepted bribes to look the other way. And in Wisconsin, the Bureau of Prohibition was especially unpopular, and it was viewed as an outside federal force interfering with local traditions. So that is why we are partially known as the wettest of states during Prohibition. So we had beer runners, and they were called Badger beer runners, because why would we just call them beer runners here? So they would bring in beer and secretly transport them, so they were running it across the state. They'd bring it to speakeasies, taverns, and then to private buyers as well. So bootlegging, it's not just limited to beer. Obviously, in rural areas, they're making moonshine, and these bootleggers would come, buy the moonshine, and then bring it into the bigger cities as well. And oftentimes, those making moonshine, they were family operations, kind of supplementing their income. So, let's talk about some raids and busts in Neenah. This, a lot of these slides are just great examples, fun examples, maybe fun for some people, of things that happened in our community. So from what I could find, I did not find that we had any speakeasies. So, womp womp. Okay, did we?
Okay, no formal speakeasies. However, there were some in Menasha, where Neenah people were getting busted at. But there were a number of businesses that were illegally selling alcohol. Now, what the code name for it was, or how you approached the employee to ask for such a beverage, I'm not sure. But there were definite crackdowns happening on businesses in Neenah that were illegally selling alcohol to people.
So, like we said, if you're not drinking alcohol out in the open, you're probably okay, just be smart. But this guy here, he was fighting, biting, and clawing with local police, so he got a drunk and disorderly.
Plenty of those went out.
Plenty of those were going on at that time. This one's important. I want you to remember this name, Herbert. Herbert Kerr. He got in trouble because he was creating a disturbance outside of the S.A. Cook Armory following a basketball game. So he was being a disturbance, probably he was drunk, and he had to pay a fine of $5 and costs of the action. So I'm not really sure what that means, but $5 and then some. So when we talked about people would stockpile alcohol? It's usually the wealthy people that were stockpiling the alcohol because they could afford it. So in Neenah, we had some wine bandits, and they stole about $1,000 worth of wine from the G.S. Gaylord residence.
So this is now the William Wing House, the house on the point with the lions? Oh, yeah, that house.
That house.
So these guys raided their wine cellar while they were out of town.
Yep.
And it was something like California port. I mean, it was...
Yeah, I don't think they knew what they were doing. They were 19 and 20-year-olds, so they just probably saw a bottle and were like, port, that sounds like...
They went for the good stuff, yeah.
That sounds like something we should drink in large quantities. So this was in 1921, and they were not home at the Gaylord residence the first time. 4 youths ranged in age from 19 to 20 years of age, and they stole the port. And they stole it from the basement. They broke a window and went in. And the bottles were taken to the S.A. Cook Armory and drunken on the premises. And that same night, there was a disturbance there. And someone named Herbert Kerr was arrested for being drunk and disorderly. So if I had to imagine, if I was a 19 or 20-year-old boy and I got arrested for being drunk and disorderly, but I had just stolen port from someone's house, I'd be like, oh, thank God. So they were probably feeling invincible, so they decided to go again, a couple weeks later. This time, they were home, but it was a very windy night, so the family and the servant said, that's probably why we didn't hear anyone. But the boys took a laundry basket and filled it with wine. And didn't get away for very long. It didn't tell me exactly how they got caught, but they got caught. And then they all had to pay very large fines. And yeah, so we had some bandits in here in Neenah. The wine bandits is what I like to call them. So I saw this term a lot, and I was like, what does mopping up mean? But in 1921, we see the local police department working with federal prohibition officers. And they were called mopping parties. And in this specific article, C.H. Watts, who was the police chief in Neenah at the time, went with a federal prohibition officer to the house of Sam Anderson on 425 West North Water Street. He had a still and that was confiscated and 15 gallons of mash. At the home of Paul Malchow of 315 West Forest Ave, his house was also raided. A still was found, and it was in use at the time, and a quantity of moonshine was destroyed. So they didn't just take the moonshine or the beer, anything that they found, they had to destroy it. Because remember, we said corruption was a problem? Because, I mean, if it's outlawed, you'd probably just take it yourself, bring it home. But they had to, destroy it. And on that same night, they were busy. They also went to Charles Adams at 211 Union Street and found a quantity of liquor on the premises. What's funny is, while they were there, a car drove up, and inside the car was a quantity of liquor that was hidden. So basically, his alcohol dealer came to the house at the wrong time, and they took the guy, his name was Charles Love, back to Kimberly, and they searched his house, and they found a complete still for making moonshine. So they had a busy night. But if you're like me, I was wondering, what is a still and what is mash? So, little science lesson here. Still is the equipment used to make distilled spirits. So that's what heats up fermented liquid, so the alcohol vaporizes and then cools it back to liquid form, making alcohol. And mash is the mixture of grains, water, sugar, and yeast that is produced to ferment, or that is used to ferment to produce the alcohol. So common grains that were used, corn, barley, rye, or wheat. And bootleggers would often cook mash in big barrels or tubs, and then sometimes they'd hide them outdoors or in hidden sheds. Obviously, these guys didn't hide their mash very well because they were found. So mash is the raw mixture, still is the device. So you can see one of the stills up there. This one, county and federal men in 2 raids. So as time goes on in the 20s, you see more where it's the county and the federal, and there's more federal prohibition officers that are coming into Neenah. This was interesting. So this is when the Cozy Bar was raided. That was on East Wisconsin Avenue. And the officers were actually unsuccessful in finding any illicit liquor at the establishment. But they did find a quantity of moon. So, moonshine, the moon. And then this I just thought was really funny because it was in the paper. So how do you apprehend a lady bootlegger? Just grab her by the wrist only. Don't touch any other part. Just the wrist. So there's a nice how-to from your local newspaper.
So
Yeah.
there are other things going on as well.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Neenah had horse racing track,
Yes.
and everybody went there
Yep.
and had fun.
Yep. So this is an example of like a seemingly innocent event that lots of people got arrested at. So it's a barn dance. You'd think that's just good, wholesome fun at the John Ida farm, but people got arrested. Because first there was 18-year-old, I'm sorry, also if this is anyone's family, I'm just naming names. Just reading what's in the paper. So an 18-year-old from Menasha, George Ponto, He was arraigned for being drunk in a public place at the barn dance. He pleaded guilty. He had to pay $50, which at that time, as an 18-year-old, that's a lot of money. But his friend Oliver Olson from Neenah, he was charged for resisting an officer. Basically, he saw his friend Olson getting arrested, and he decided, I'm gonna step in. So he got arrested. Then we had a Harold Hudel of Dale, and he was charged with the illegal sale of moonshine. And Alpha Pratt of Rhinelander was charged with illegal purchase of intoxicating liquor. So to me, it sounds like someone brought moonshine, people were purchasing, people got drunk, they got raided. So, like you said, I'm sure at the horse races, there's probably some illegal drinking going on or selling of things. It all kind of becomes kind of shady and like a deal done in the dark. But yeah, these things were definitely happening here in
And those
Neenah.
things started in like 1880s.
Yes. Yep. And hotels were also pretty popular places where raids happened and where people got arrested. So the Gehring Hotel, this happened to them a couple times, where they had a local police raid and there was moonshine whiskey. They found about a gallon that was seized by the federal prohibition officers. And then they had another one where, I think this one was also at a hotel, at the Anderson Hotel. Someone was too drunk and disturbed people at a local hotel, and so he got arrested. And then again, at the Gehring Hotel, there's another raid that had to go on. So I don't know what was going on there, but lots of things. So speaking of hotels, we've got this guy. In 1925, Holgar Skafte, he was the proprietor of the Lakeside Hotel, and he was arrested for the possession and sale of intoxicating liquor. So the Lakeside Hotel was located at 129 Lake Street, and for some time the hotel was suspected by Neenah police as a place where liquor could be bought. So in August of 1925, the hotel was raided by Chief Watts again, and Skafte, along with one customer, were taken into custody. This is my favorite part. The customer was so drunk, he couldn't give his first name. So he was placed in a holding cell until he sobered up a bit, and he could give him his name. So originally, Holger pleaded not guilty, but then he changed his plea to guilty. So he was immediately sentenced, and then he had to go to a workhouse. So oftentimes you'd get fines, you'd go to jail, or you'd get sent to the workhouse, is usually how they dealt with this. We also were on an air bootlegger route here in Neenah. So bootleggers would come over the Canadian border to the Fox Valley to bring whiskey. Unfortunately for this one, the guy literally had to drop it and then get back in his plane and go because he was getting raided. But when they got the whiskey, they found out it was doped, which means he basically gave them subpar alcohol and put like food coloring in it to make it look brown. So that was common as well. So Canada became a major supplier of alcohol to the US, especially along the border states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. But you know, we also have the lakes, so they would do it by boat, including also by air. And this was quite dangerous, especially if you're doing it by air, because it's the 1920s, so planes aren't amazing yet, or very safe. So you had bad weather, mechanical failures, and of course the constant risk of getting caught. But profits were enormous during this time, so it was worth the risk. This is another guy who went to go get a Christmas tree and didn't really know what happened after. He met a bootlegger and he doesn't know, so he sat for 5 days to ponder his memory lapse of what happened. So I don't know what kind of alcohol he was drinking, but it was potent. So beer samples, they would take beer samples from places that legally were selling, like near beer or soda or things like that. They would take samples. This was in 1928. Police would go to 4 different places. One was, again, the Cozy Lunch. This is at 113 East Wisconsin. The Lakeside Hotel, again, on Lake Street. Radio Lunch at 224 West Wisconsin Ave. and the Malouf lunchroom on the corner of Main Street and West Dewey Ave. I don't know if any arrests were made at that time. They didn't really say in the paper, but they would just randomly go in to do testing to make sure they were actually selling near beer and not actual beer. But unfortunately, calamity happened to the Cozy Lunchroom in December of 1928. This is a funny story. So there's 3 federal prohibition agents that are just walking around downtown Neenah on their way to the hotel, and they decide to stop somewhere for lunch. Not at the Cozy Lunchroom, but they smell beer as they walk past. And so one of them says, let's go back later. So he goes back later, enters the bar room, and purchases a glass of beer. They say in the newspaper it's probably near beer. And he said it was so good, in fact, that he needed to test it. So he whips out a testing kit right then and there, and he walks behind the bar to test the beer. And the other 2 federal agents walk in, kick everyone out of the place, and they literally ransack the establishment. So if they suspected you were manufacturing or selling beer, I mean, they weren't nice about checking. Like, they were throwing stuff around into the yards, they completely would destroy it. But they found a complete brewing plant on the 2nd floor, and a large quantity of beer was in the basement, and they had to pour it all out. That took all of a half hour, and the federal guys said, okay, and they just left. So eventually the Cozy Room did have to close, and they lost their license. So the end of Prohibition, by the late 1920s, it's quite clear, as you could see, Prohibition really wasn't working well. Alcohol consumption, when it initially dropped, bootlegging and speakeasies soon brought drinking back, but it was just illegal. So enforcement was costly. The Bureau of Prohibition was underfunded, outnumbered, and plagued by corruption. And everyday citizens, not just organized criminals, were ignoring the law. The Great Depression further eroded support. Repealing prohibition meant jobs and tax revenue from a revived brewing and distilling industry. So in 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment, officially ending prohibition. And it's the only time in U.S. history an amendment has been repealed. Yay, the end of prohibition. So prohibition tried to change culture through law, but alcohol was too embedded in daily life. Especially in immigrant-heavy communities like in Wisconsin, where beer and taverns were social staples. And instead of eliminating crime, it created new opportunities for organized crime, like syndicates, smugglers, and bootleggers, and even the beer runners and the air bootleggers. Many ordinary citizens became lawbreakers by frequenting speakeasies, making home brews, or buying from local bootleggers. So this eroded respect for both the law and government authority. Enforcement was inconsistent, and ultimately, Prohibition failed to deliver its promised reforms for a healthier, more moral communities. And instead, instead, it left behind a legacy of what we think of today when we think of Prohibition, resistance, crime, and division. So for Neenah, like much of Wisconsin, Prohibition was more about federal intrusion and local defiance, and a chapter where national movements clashed with local culture. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
Here, hold on.
Oh, let me bring the mic over.
When Prohibition was over and the alcohol tax came back, why did they keep the income tax?
It all comes down to one thing. Money.
That's a really good question.
I mean, it's something we ask ourselves to this day. I'm gonna guess it's money. How can we say no to more money?
Call your local congressman.
Any other questions? Yes? In Ohio. So she's asking if the Women Christians Temperance Union, WCTU, was in Cleveland, Ohio, or Cleveland, Wisconsin. It started in Cleveland, Ohio. But yes, we had our chapters here too. Anything else? Yes?
I just wonder if you had any statistics of the temperance movement, what percentage were male and what percentage were female?
Ooh, that's a good question.
I mean, you mean like the temperance, those in favor?
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I think that because it was one of the first ways for women to kind of band together against something, and that it went along so closely with the suffrage movement, we oftentimes hear more about the female perspective, but I can assure you there were just as many men who were in favor or who were out speaking in favor of it or donating towards it. I mean, the Anti-Saloon League, while it had women employed, was a primarily male-dominant organization.
I grew up in Milwaukee, so Prohibition, you know, those bars that you see there, they were gathering places for the community, really, just like Cheers, right? But when I came here and married my husband, he was Methodist, and they could not drink or smoke or dance, and I thought, this is unbelievable.
Did you convert him?
Well, he converted himself, let me tell you. He made up for everything, but I was a shock coming from Milwaukee where, you know, I didn't even know any Methodists that would go along with that, to tell you the truth.
So,
I was Lutheran,
same, yes.
Same.
Yeah, the Lutherans and the Catholics, we're just fine with the alcohol. But so that was something interesting that we talked about in regards to our research. So when we talk about First Presbyterian, when we talk about the Methodist Church in Neenah, when the original settlers, the white settlers, came to this area, they all came from the East Coast, right? So they were considered native born. And if you were in need of a church service, the Presbyterian and the Methodists were the ones who had traveling ministers at the time. So many of the early settlers here were converts to those religions. So they were very well rooted and very well established here. So by the time the Lutherans and the Catholics come, you kind of had this native born versus immigrant born. If anyone has seen the Gangs of New York, a little bit like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions? Comments?
I will add a fun fact on, if you didn't know this already. Do you know why we have Welch's grape juice? So the Methodists could have communion. It was a Methodist who reverse engineered the fermentation process to have grape juice drinkable without having the alcohol content.
Thank you, Miranda.
That is interesting. There's a trivia question there. Anything else?
I heard that Smith Park in Menasha, they're not allowed to sell alcohol there for any event. Was it potentially related to Alicia D. Smith's attitudes about liquor?
So, yes, Elisha D. Smith, I can't speak for that portion of the family. I'm not sure which religion do you know, Jeff?
What?
Which religion the Smith family belonged to? Menasha Woodenware. So it does relate to Neenah's ability or lack of ability to sell alcohol in public parks. That was actually an order put in by many of the donors of the parklands who were in favor of temperance and prohibition. Yes. So likely, Menasha is the same.
It's like Shattuck Park.
Shattuck Park, Riverside Park, literally any park in the city of Neenah except the Whiting Boathouse. And if you know anything about George Whiting, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming.